Another element that we need to think about with adolescents and their relationships with their peers are romantic relationships and sexual behaviour. When adolescents are asked about their romantic relationships, we can see that a relatively small number of 12-year-olds are in romantic relationships, but a much larger proportion of 18-year-olds are in romantic relationships. This is hardly surprising as they are maturing through that period of time. Something that it is useful to note is that heterosexual relationships tend to begin in mixed gender groups. Those young people who start dating early, again this is heterosexual romantic relationships, early dating is associated with very risky behaviour, especially if we're looking at early maturing girls who have older boyfriends. The amount of risk involved also depends on the quality of their other relationships. So a young person who has a poor relationship with their parents may fall in love a lot, but end up mistrusting or mistreating their romantic partners and actually fail to emotionally bond to them. And so we end up in situations where these young people are at increased risk for substance abuse and mental illnesses such as anxiety and depression. If we look at the young people who start dating later, so between 15 and 19, there are actually more positive than negative effects, and it's very much associated with positive social development. So for young people in years 10 and 11, entering steady romantic relationships is good for self-esteem, and it's protective because it means they have lower rates or lower risk of being involved with drugs and alcohol, and a positive long-term romantic relationship in this age bracket can compensate for poor parental relationships. Now, LGBTIAQ plus romantic relationships with peers get a little bit more complex. So first thing you need to know is more adolescent girls than boys identify as members of sexual minorities. So the longitudinal study of Australian children asked a sexual attraction question to a sample of about 3,500 young people aged between 14 and 15 in 2014. And in that sample, 1.2% of girls reported feeling sexually attracted to other girls exclusively, 4.4% had feelings of attraction to both boys and girls, and 4.4% were unsure about their attractions. Whereas among the boys, 0.4% reported feeling sexually attracted only to other boys, and 2% to both boys and girls. 1.7% were unsure, 1.7%. So as for the adult population, more adolescent girls than boys fell into the combined sexual minority category. 1 in 18 girls, that's 5.6%, compared with 1 in 42 boys, which is 2.4%, and that's excluding the unsure group. It's important to note that many people do not identify as LGBTIQ+ until early adulthood or later. Another complicating factor, of course, is that there is considerable instability in adolescent and young adult reports of same-sex attraction or sexual behaviour. By late teens, so 18, 19, there's the added complication of young women starting to identify themselves as mostly straight, i.e. mostly heterosexual, but somewhat attracted to females. Another point about sexual minority adolescents is that the majority of them would like to have romances, but it's difficult for them to do so. So they could be fearing rejection. Most of them are willing to approach only people who are already out, and there's not likely to be that many in a school or community. And even if they know 2 or 3 are the same sex, lesbian or gay or non-binary teenagers, they're going to face issues around opportunities and the lack of acceptance in that social environment. They don't want to run the risk of losing the few friends they can really relate to, and there are concerns about who's interested in their relationship with them. So this is a question about adolescent romantic relationships that we're going to explore in the tutorial. If we look at sexual behaviour, the Youth Risk Behaviour Survey is a US survey which has, as you can see there, a very large sample group. So those students from across the US completed a questionnaire containing 86 questions during one of their classes at school. And then in adulthood, randomly chosen participants from that survey were matched against the overall population for gender, race and ethnicity, age, education and marital status. And what we ended up with was what you see on this slide here. The percentage of high school students who ever had sexual intercourse across that 10-year period. So the interest, and this is now 10 years old, so it would be really interesting to see the up-to-date rates. And remembering this is US data, so it dropped quite substantially in the 90s, and then has stayed fairly stable since then. So US data looking at around 47%. Now, if we look at Australian data from the National Survey of Australian Secondary Students in Sexual Health, we've got more recent data, but not as big a pool of participants. So the 2018 National Survey of Australian Secondary Students in Sexual Health had just under 6,500 Year 10, 11 and 12 students. 47% of them had engaged in sexual intercourse. Of those sexually active respondents, 76% had sex at home, 65% with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, 62% often or always used a condom, and 86% were having intercourse with somebody of a very similar age to them. So we can say that sexual activity is also a normative part of an Australian teenager's life. Talking with parents about sex is always interesting. So having good communication between parents and adolescents about sex tends to stop the adolescents from engaging in risky sexual behaviour, but it does very little to prevent them from being sexually active. What is really important in here is that attitudes matter. So people identifying as female who have permissive or liberal parents, talking about sex was associated with more sexual activity. Whereas among girls whose parents disapprove of sexual activity, that does not track. And in summary, we can see that most students are learning about sex ed at school, which is great. Learning at school is better than learning from pornography. However, 40% of them failed to use a condom or practice safe sex practices in the most recent time they had sex, which means that sexually active teenagers are engaging in high rates of risky sexual behaviour despite what they're taught about safe sex at school. So our big question is, what is causing that? Part of it is a lack of knowledge. Again, the Australian 2018 sexual practice survey, 87% of teenagers did not believe they were likely to get an STI, and that's largely unchanged since 1992. From the US data, teens and young adults represent almost half of all new STIs reported, even though they only represent a quarter of all sexually active individuals. This is a problem. So the high rate of contracting STIs among teenagers is thought in part to be due to failure of abstinence-only programs that attempt to discourage sexual activity, and also the cognition and social factors that inhibit teens from using contraception, and the likelihood of having multiple partners. Traditionally, intervention efforts have targeted individual level factors associated with STI risk, and that does not address higher level factors such as peer norms and media influences that may also influence behaviours. Interventions for at-risk adolescents and young adults that address the underlying aspects of social and cultural conditions affecting sexual risk-taking behaviours are needed, as are strategies designed to improve the underlying social conditions themselves. In addition, in designing STI preventative programs, we need to give consideration to the needs of the adolescent and young adult populations, including things like extended clinic hours, optimising privacy and waiting rooms, and urine-based specimen collections.